For about 20 years, when we talked about dark personalities, we were really only talking about 3 of them. But what if there was a 4th? One that actually enjoys cruelty. Today, we're diving into the research that added a new and honestly pretty chilling dimension to how we understand human nature.
Okay, so what do we even mean when we say dark personalities? It's a heavy term, right? Well, for a long time, science had a pretty specific answer, and it all revolved around a famous group of 3 known as the Dark Triad.
And here's the classic lineup, the original Dark Triad, which was all hammered out back in 2002. First up, you've got narcissism. That's the huge ego, the I'm better than everyone vibe. Then there's Machiavellianism. This is your master manipulator, the person who sees everyone else as just a piece on their chessboard. And rounding it out is psychopathy, which is all about being impulsive, selfish, and just, well, antisocial. For ages, this was the model. This was how he studied the not-so-nice side of personality in everyday people.
But here's the thing. Even as this Dark Triad idea got super popular, a lot of psychologists had this nagging feeling, like the picture wasn't quite complete. They felt like this framework, as good as it was, just didn't cover all the bases of, truly malevolent behavior. It was like this exclusive club of bad guys might need to let in a new member.
So, what was this missing piece of the puzzle? Well, the research started pointing to a trait that's, let's be honest, both pretty familiar and pretty disturbing: everyday sadism.
Yeah, everyone started zeroing in on this one specific trait, sadism. Now, we're not talking about the extreme, clinical version you see in the movies. This is about a more common, everyday kind of sadism. And with this new addition, the famous Dark Triad was about to get an upgrade to the Dark Tetrad.
And this is the key idea that the research really drills down on. Everyday sadism isn't just about not caring about others. It's about getting actual pleasure from someone else's suffering, whether you're the one causing it or you're just kicking back and watching it happen.
Okay, now this is super important because it helps us untangle 2 things people mix up all the time: sadism and psychopathy. Look, for a psychopath, hurting someone is just a tool. It's a means to an end, right? They're trying to get money or power or whatever. They really don't care about the suffering itself. But for a sadist, the suffering is the whole point. The cruelty is its own reward.
So where does this everyday sadism actually show up? Well, in some pretty familiar places, actually. Like internet trolls who just love to stir up drama for the lulz. Or people who get a real kick out of super violent movies. It can even be that person in your life who just loves making those incredibly cruel jokes at someone else's expense.
Okay, so adding sadism to the list sounds straightforward, right? But for scientists, it created a huge problem. How in the world do you measure it accurately? How do you make sure you're really measuring sadism and not just another dark trait? That was the big measurement challenge they had to crack.
And here's what they were up against. The old personality tests just weren't cutting it. The questions they used to measure sadism overlapped so much with the ones for psychopathy that it was a total mess. You couldn't tell where one started and the other one stopped. And look, if you can't measure them separately, you can't really study them separately either. The researchers themselves said it best in their paper that this overlap hampers independent measurement. Basically, it was a massive roadblock. You could be running a whole study thinking you're learning about sadism when really you might just be measuring psychopathy in a slightly different way. To get any real answers, they absolutely needed a new, sharper tool.
So to tackle this head-on, the researchers decided to do something really ambitious. They set out to build a brand new personality test from scratch, designed specifically for this new 4-trait model, the Dark Tetrad.
The goal was simple, but tough. Create one short, precise questionnaire that can measure all 4 of these dark traits: narcissism, Machiavellianism, psychopathy, and sadism, but in a way that could cleanly tell them apart. And the result of all this work was something they called the Short Dark Tetrad, or SD4 for short. And trust me, building this thing was a huge project. We're talking 3 separate studies with over 2,500 people participating. As you can see here, they started with this big pool of potential questions, and then they just whittled them down and down and down again, using some pretty heavy-duty stats, until they were left with a final, rock-solid set of 28 questions, 7 for each of the 4 dark traits.
And this diagram, which looks kind of complicated, basically shows the payoff. It's the proof that they succeeded. You can see the 4 traits here, and yeah, they're all connected, which makes sense, but the model proves that they are absolutely distinct concepts. And now, thanks to the SD4, they can be measured independently. From a research perspective, this was a total game changer.
All right, so they've built this powerful new tool. Now what? What did they actually find out once they could measure these traits properly? Well, this is where things get really, really interesting.
Whoa. Okay, one of the first things that just jumped off the page was a massive gender difference when it came to sadism. That number you see, 1.07, that's a statistical thing called an effect size, and it basically tells you how big the difference is. Now, to give you some context, anything over 0.8 is considered a large effect. So 1.07, that's huge. It means that on average, the men in this study scored way higher on everyday sadism than the women did.
Then, they started looking at how these traits actually affect a person's life. They broke it down into two simple things: how you feel about yourself, your personal adjustment, and how you get along with other people, your interpersonal adjustment. And the results are pretty fascinating. Check this out. Narcissists, they actually report feeling good about themselves. But when you look at how people relate to others, that's where the story changes. Both psychopathy and sadism are tied to really, really negative outcomes in relationships.
So what's the big takeaway here? It's that having these dark traits doesn't necessarily mean a person is miserable on the inside. In fact, some of them might feel pretty great about themselves. The real darkness shows up in the damage and the conflict they create in their relationships with everyone else.
And then there was this, probably the biggest surprise of the whole study. When the researchers looked at sex drive, everyone kind of figured it would be linked to the impulsive nature of psychopathy. But nope. As the quote says, the single strongest predictor was sadism. The people who scored higher on enjoying cruelty also reported having a higher sex drive. That's a totally new finding, and it just blows the door wide open for future research.
So at the end of the day, this research really cements the idea that everyday sadism is its own unique part of this dark personality family, and it gives scientists a solid way to actually measure it. And that kind of leaves us with a pretty heavy question to think about, right? If the tendency to actually enjoy cruelty exists in all of us, on a spectrum just like any other personality trait, what does that really say about the dark side of human nature?